So, welcome, Kelsie. It's great to have you here. I'm very busy, so I appreciate you taking the time. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about you and the work that you're doing there at Kansas University?
Sure. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Kansas and have a research lab that really focuses on ways to better understand the diagnosis and assessment of eating disorders. And a lot of my work focuses on using comorbidity to better inform how we think about eating disorders with the goal of eventually trying to tailor treatments to really capture the underlying comorbidity as well as the eating pathology that often drives a lot of the problems that our clients have. And of course, a huge focus of my research also is assessment because I think that treatment and assessment really do go hand in hand, as you were saying, Jenna. If we have a good assessment, we can do a better treatment plan. There's a lot of research showing that if you do a strong outcomes assessment, you can actually treat your clients faster
Right.
and more effectively than if you don't have that information. So I'm really interested in kind of having some of the tools in the toolbox to be able to do what we do as well as we can. So that's really the focus of my research. I've got a great research team here that I'm really excited to work with, a lot of really great collaborators on campus here and then at other universities. And so that's just a little bit about some of the work that we're currently doing and kind of the directions that we're going to go into.
Very exciting. We're very lucky to have you contributing this really important research to the field. Um, so, can you talk me back a little bit about what first inspired you to develop the EPSI? Like, what was the specific need that you saw for this measure?
Well, it was kind of in some ways a little bit of an accident how I came upon this. So my advisor does a lot of work with measurement development, but it wasn't something I thought was incredibly exciting when I was in graduate school. I submitted a paper that was really focused on comorbidity, and one of the comments that I got back from one of the editors was that I couldn't use the self-report measure in the study because the editor didn't really feel like it was truly strongly related to eating disorders. And I thought, well, this is totally ridiculous. And as you know, after I got over kind of my shock with this comment, I went and I thought, well, I'm going to look through the literature so that I can write this response back to the editor to say, no, this is a great measure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's
Right.
quite widely. And when I was going through research looking into this measure more and more, I realized that there were some problems. And that got me really interested because I think sometimes measures get used again and again in the literature, and we don't stop to think about exactly the properties of this measure.
Right.
And that led me to look into other measures too, and I got really interested and kind of excited about some of the problems because all the issues that I saw were very solvable.
Right.
And a lot of the issues that I saw, I really thought were the product of the fact that eating disorders is a relatively young field.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of the measures were developed in the early 80s when
Right.
we had just introduced bulimia nervosa into the diagnostic system. So we didn't really have a lot of research on bulimia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa was a condition a lot of people were not aware of at the time. And so the field has really come quite a ways. Since that time, our understanding of the psychopathology of eating disorders has changed. And there's a really strong approach to scale development that I thought we could take that's been used in other fields to really develop a measure that would be even more clinically useful.
Right.
So that was kind of my initial thought process. And I also reflected on what some of the issues I had clinically in working with patients. You know, I kind of had my little test battery that I would often give to clients the first time they would come to see me. And I usually gave about 3 measures because I usually would give like the bullet because I wanted to look at a measure that had some binge eating
Mm-hmm.
questions, some purging questions, and then I usually gave a measure that would look more at restricting type of psychopathology like the EAT. So I had kind
Right.
of a batch of measures that I was giving, which, you know, obviously when you have a big battery, it takes more time for the client, but I really wanted to get all this information. And so when I thought about what kind of a measure I wanted to develop, I really thought, you know, I really would like to have an all-in-one to the extent possible that really broadly captured a lot of the different eating issues that clients have. And that was something that could be really informative for tracking the client's change over time.
Right.
So that kind of got me excited. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting when I was thinking about starting to develop this measure was a lot of the literature I looked at in scale development, their measures were based on very small samples.
Right.
So you can't do it too much when you have a small sample to develop a scale really strongly. Those kind of small samples that were almost exclusively young women. And it was really geared more, I think, at that time for anorexia nervosa. But we know now a lot of the clients that work with us, particularly with bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder, either overweight or obese. But these measures typically weren't developed or originally normed in those populations. And we need to know information on these clients because they're really important in our clinical work. They're coming in to see us, and we need to make sure we're using a measure that does well with that group of people. And also I noticed that, of course we have men who have eating disorders, and we really need to use a measure that has good, strong, valid psychometric properties across these populations with whom we do work with.
Absolutely.
And so I thought that that was a really kind of an important consideration. And so that really led me to structure the development of the EPSI in a way that I thought was going to be most likely that we would develop something that could be useful for really the range of types of issues clients present with and the range of different types of clients who seek treatment.
That's incredible, and it's certainly something that I think every clinician is mindful of is their varied caseload. You see people presenting from the whole spectrum, as well as burden on their patients. How much time can you really ask a patient to be completing those questionnaires and pulling that data together? So efficiency is increasingly important as we face increasing need for our services and caseloads, and time becomes even more precious. And so you mentioned this was sort of your hypothesis, and you identified this is something that the field really needs in practice and in research. I guess the next step is, how do you go about creating a measure that addresses this need? Like, what's the process there?
Yeah. Well, one thing I didn't mention too that really does kind of tie into the process is a lot of eating disorder measures have a number of strengths. So, there's a lot of good things in all the eating disorder measures for sure. One thing across the board that seemed to be a pretty big problem for the eating disorder measures was what we call instability of factor structure. And I'm not going to go into the statistics. We'll not want to hear that. But the problem that happens is that essentially the factor structure is the subscales. And if the subscales themselves aren't stable over time, then you don't know if you have a client, are they changing week to week just because the measure itself is pretty unstable, or is it because they're truly changing? And so it is really important to make sure that those subscales are very stable unless there's true change that's happening, right? And so that was a real key consideration for me. And so to make sure you have a stable measure, you need a lot of people.
Yes.
And you need to really think about what constructs do you want to assess. So honestly, my research team and I collaborated with a number of people to think about what constructs we want to assess, how do we want to design this project, and kind of that thinking phase took about a year.
Right.
We essentially wrote items, but we didn't want to just write items. We wanted to think about, through the literature and clinical practice, different experts' opinions, what are the key aspects of eating disorder psychopathology. And so we came up with a total of about 20 constructs, things we thought are relevant or important concepts, and then we wrote items to target those concepts. So in all, we wrote about 200 items, and I think we wrote about 160 items just to start with to assess our 20 different constructs. And then the next kind of phase is to administer those items, but it's a very iterative process where you're administering it to a pretty large sample. So we would administer, to start with, we had a couple of samples that were each about 400 individuals. One was a community sample, one was a student sample, about 50% were male. and we had a strong number of individuals who were obese or overweight so that we could kind of look at these issues. And we tested these items to see how do they do, are they replicating across these groups of interest, are these items seeming to be reliable, are they kind of hanging together in the way that we think, and of course we identified some problems, and so we made a bunch of changes. We wrote some new items to try to do a better job of some of the problem areas, and then we re-administered the items to about 160 patients with eating disorders who had a pretty substantial serious issue. They were inpatients and
Right.
intensive outpatients, and then a general psychiatric sample. And again, went through the process of seeing where there are some problems, cleaning things up, and then at that stage, we were able to kind of whittle down to about 45 items, which is the final version of the EPSI, and then we retested them again in a sample that was a college sample to look at how reliable they were over time. So in total, we've assessed, hundreds of items in about, I think, about 2,000 individuals across a range of severity, across a range of different types of presentations, because again, we really wanted to make sure that this measure was going to be something that was useful for a broad range of contexts. And even since we've developed the measure, we've continued to do research looking at the properties of the measure. We've done some translation, so we're always trying to work on how can we improve this measure to make it the strongest we possibly can.
And the
So
items, yeah, and the items that you were left with were those that had the strongest kind of power in loading into that factor structure, right? Yeah, wow. And there was another consideration, correct me if I'm wrong, when you were developing these, which was about how are the participants interpreting these questions and making it relatable, so trying to break away from clinical jargon to something that people understand. Right.
my advisor, who he's never written about this, but he always says this to us, is that you need to develop a measure that passes the Walmart test.
That's a good rule of thumb.
Is the average person that you just would run into at Walmart going to understand this item? If the answer is no, you do not have a good question, because our clients come in with a range of different experiences and backgrounds, and we don't want to be explaining what this means. We want it to be very clear.
Mm-hmm.
And so we try to make the language very simple. We try with each question to assess one and only one thing,
Mm-hmm.
because we know that sometimes it can be very confusing if you're asking multiple things in one question. And so basically we tried to really make a very clean, very simple questionnaire so that really, it's going to be understandable to as many clients as possible. And that was a really important consideration. So when I say, we came up with the items and the constructs, that was one really important piece. But we spent a lot of time on just the wording of the question itself. And I will say it was probably some of the most fun team meetings I've ever had, when we were laughing hysterically at some items that some people wrote that were just, not so good. But we tried to obviously to get rid of those, to really come up with something that's very simple and straightforward.
It's certainly something that stood out to me when I read the measure, and that distinguishes it from other measures was this is so relatable. It's in plain English, and the response format is the same for each question, whereas some of the other measures really jump around, which I think can be somewhat confusing or take up more time and processing. So for the audience and the people participating here, what are some of the things that the EPSI in its final format can tell them about their patients? Well, actually, sorry, I've jumped a question. Before that, can you tell us a little about the individual scales and what they can tell you about your patients?
So one scale that is very central to a lot of patients with eating disorders is body dissatisfaction. And in fact, that scale in some ways is kind of an overarching scale that really does relate to the other scales. One of the main reasons people come in for treatment is because they're having a lot of problems with body dissatisfaction. Obviously, that's a key consideration. We tried as much as possible to try to reduce some of the gender bias and how we asked about body dissatisfaction. I think we do probably still have some more work to do in that area, But that was something that we were really focused on. Another concept that is probably very useful and something you've heard about a lot is a scale called cognitive restraint.
Yes.
These are efforts to cut back or limit what one is eating, regardless of whether those efforts are successful. So this may, somebody's trying to diet. They may not actually, when I say successful, obviously it's not successful, but they may have lapses in their efforts to restrain their eating. And so that's a concept that's been around for a really long time. And in fact, people who score high on restraint tend to be higher in their body weight.
Right.
So when a stressful moment comes along, their cognitive resources are taxed, they're really prone to these lapses where they will have maybe overeating or binge eating episodes.
Right.
So that's an important concept. We want to definitely reduce our clients' cognitive restraint.
Right. And you found a relationship between that and body weight, BMI, didn't you?
In general, cognitive restraint is related to increased BMI, and we're really interested in also information on restricting.
Right.
So one is, these cognitive efforts to limit what one is eating. The other is when we have clients who have anorexia nervosa, they're clients who don't have lapses often.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are eating very few calories, and that's a really important concept and construct. And so I was very inspired by some of the writings of Eric Stice, who's done some work to show that a lot of the restraint measures are not good measures of how much a person will actually be eating. Mm. And so with the restricting scale, we're trying to get something a little bit more concrete that would relate to actual intake behaviors without asking how much are you eating, which is also important. But this is, again, kind of an eating disorder psychopathology scale. And so what we found with the restricting scale that we came up with is that it does negatively relate to body mass index, such that individuals who are high on restricting actually do not weigh as much as individuals who score lower on restricting. So that was really, to us, useful. And restricting scale is wonderful in terms of differentiating patients with anorexia nervosa from patients with bulimia nervosa.
Right. Oh, that's good.
A very good job of distinguishing those diagnoses, and that was really exciting for us to see. So that can be a very useful feature. There's also a purging scale. We ask about things like self-induced vomiting, diuretic and laxative use. We also have kind of an interesting item. There's some laxative or herbal teas that some people use that are probably a little bit more popular several years ago. But that's another item related to purging. We have a scale that focuses on muscle building. It's not included in the recovery record application, but this is a scale that is more central or relevant to men and eating pathology as it presents in men and some of the muscle dysmorphia concepts. We also have negative attitudes toward obesity, which again is another scale that's not included in the recovery record application, but something I was very interested in because this could have potentially, we don't know, we need to do more research, some clinical applications in terms of if you have a client who comes in and has very strong negative attitudes toward obesity, how does this kind of interact with clinicians' body weight in predicting treatment outcomes. We also have binge eating scale, which we tried, this is kind of gets to your point again, Jenna, of trying to assess things in a very simple way that people would understand. So we did try all of the DSM items. We did try the ways that, people and clinicians typically ask about binge eating. But we found things like, do you eat into the, kind of past the point of feeling full, kind of stuffing yourself. Those are some of the items that clients really, really related to.
Right.
So we find the binge eating scale does very well so far, so that's been exciting. And then another scale that we had was excessive exercise. And so this is really pushing, oneself to the point of exhaustion, exercising really beyond capacity. And this has been interesting to look at too. It's related to things like cognitive restraint and restricting things you'd expect, but it's also very highly related to muscle building. So thinking about kind of some of the gender differences and reasons for excessive exercise became very apparent. There's high levels of excessive exercise in a lot of the men that we see, but it was for a very different reason. And so we tried to not say always about exercising to burn calories, but really get this frenzied, intensive exercise, and so that it wasn't just kind of more of a woman's excessive exercise, if that makes sense. That there's different reasons for exercising way back past the point of your capacity.
Right. So you're not just tapping into the frequency, but why this is actually occurring. And that might vary from patient to patient and demographic to demographic. And, one thing that we've discussed is potentially adding the muscular scale for when we identify a user as being a male with an eating disorder, having them use that scale and to do some further research there, which can be quite interesting. And I wanted to just jump back to the binge eating. Some people on the webinar might be wondering about the difference between objective versus subjective binge eating and how you managed that or navigated that with that scale.
Well, I think to do a very sensitive assessment of binge eating, it's so hard.
Yeah, it is. It's very difficult.
And to do the distinction between subjective and objective, I mean, my team, we have a meeting each week where we really try to decide that for the research clients that we see each week, and it's very tricky. So I don't know that you could say with certainty a self-report measure would be the best way to assess that. I think as a clinician, you probably do want to do additional assessment
Right.
of that issue. But we do find that objective binge eating episodes, as we have assessed through interview, this is some data that we just finished collecting, is very strongly related to the self-report
Wow.
scale. And so that's really good news that it seems that what we would assess and agree after we've gone through and talked with the person about exactly what they ate, the DSM way of thinking about loss of control, that agrees with the self-report significantly, and the correlation is strong. With the subjective eating episodes, I think that the way in which we tried to ask about binge eating really is geared more toward the objectively large episodes.
Right.
And so it's possible, though, you would have an individual client who is interpreting it in a way that may be a little bit different than the average person. But in general, people who score high on objective binge eating and people who are higher body weight score higher on the binge eating scale for the EPSI.
Right. That's very encouraging corroboration of data there. So I might just pause for a second. If anyone has a question, now's a great time to type that into the question section. And then if there's no questions for now, we'll probably jump in to a little bit of a demonstration. Kelsie, were there any other remarks that you wanted to make about the development of the EPSI, or well, perhaps we can talk about how we came together, or the idea of implementing this through recovery record. And some people are not necessarily, the idea of implementing a measure in an app, is something that's quite new. What did you think about that initially?
Well, I was very excited about this, and it was really exciting to me to hear more about the recovery record process. I teach graduate classes in assessment, so obviously, this is my passion area, and so I always teach them about, we start off with outcomes tracking, and usually my students, we talk about what are the barriers. It's time consuming, they don't want to take time away from the therapy session, just the same concerns that every clinician has about outcomes tracking. And I share with them some of the randomized clinical trials that have been done in a lot of different fields showing the power of outcomes tracking, and most of the students aren't aware of that. And we kind of try to talk about, what are ways to solve this, because we know if you do more regular outcomes tracking, you'll be able to treat your patient faster, and then you get information about how they're doing that actually can lead you to do different things in therapy that make therapy more effective. So we know that that's true, but that doesn't take away the problems and the barriers.
Right.
To me, it was really interesting to hear about recovery record, because as the client is able to do things on their own in real time, I think you're probably getting more accurate data, and it really reduces the burden, and it makes showing and seeing the data so much easier because you're not scoring on your own. It just really makes it so much more, I think, user-friendly. And so, to me, it's so exciting because I hope that, everybody, regardless of what measure you use, does outcomes tracking, just because I think it's so powerful, and this makes it a very seamless easy process. So to me, it was kind of like, wow, this is very exciting. And what Jenna and I talked about a lot too was, okay, how do we eventually change the EPSI into kind of a week by week
Right.
format, so that you can be kind of looking at these ongoing changes on a week to week basis. And so that's some of the work that Jenna and I are starting to do together now.
Which is very exciting because a lot of these measures have been developed with research in mind, and the monthly measure is just, it's been a standard of practice, I guess, with development of measures. But, in clinical practice, a lot can change week to week. And so we're certainly very excited to be working with you at looking at the sensitivity of a week to week measure and looking at the change across those areas. And obviously for practitioners using recovery record, that will be, really important part of their evaluation of the effectiveness of care. And yeah, I think that anyone joining in will probably see that there's some alignment between Kelsie's work and ambitions for the EPSI and recovery records, which is just around access and making it a lot easier to do the things that we know to be important and effective parts of treatment. We do have a couple of questions. So Michelle Clark has asked if you could please explain the cognitive restraint measure just a little bit further, and particularly how would you explain that to an adolescent client? How would you explain that concept, which is a little bit difficult to an adolescent client?
Yeah. So to me, when I explain this to clients or even to students that I'm teaching, I think about, if you were to dive into a pool. And I remember doing this when I was little. I went off like the really high dive. I got brave for a moment, and then like, literally the second I dove, I was like, I should not have done that, because I got down so far that it took me forever to get up. It was really actually kind of scary. I finally, popped out of the surface of the water, and you can imagine what I did. I was just gasping for air, and I just, kind of put my arms on the side of the pool and just was breathing as much air as possible, for quite some time. And it's the same process, I think, when we deprive our bodies of food and nutrients. And that is a kind of cognitive mindset that a lot of our clients have. It's kind of, I'm going to wake up and be really good today, and I'm not going to eat, I'm just going to have this very stringent diet. And so it's kind of this mindset that's filtered on. And that as the body is deprived of calories for too long, it kind of has the same reaction as when you get out of the pool. You're really, really, really hungry, and you want to eat a lot of food because that's the body's response to being starved.
Right.
And so if something comes along that kind of knocks that mindset out, something like really stressful, argument with your parents, maybe a kid looked at you some way that made you feel bad about yourself, it's hard for the person to kind of stay in that mindset because it's such a strict mindset. And kind of when that mindset gets thrown out, the body's response is saying, eat something. The person is stressed, and so they're prone to lapses in eating and end up overeating.
Right.
That's kind of the flavor behind cognitive restraint, is it's a mindset, and it is a mindset that's easily disrupted by other types of external or even internal processes, hunger, stress. And so people who have that strong mindset often are more prone to overeat.
Right.
Than people who don't have that mindset. So it's in some ways akin to dieting.
Right.
And we know that it's really not a very successful strategy. That's why a lot of our treatments are designed to help people establish a really regular pattern of eating, so they don't get into this process where they're so stressed and they're so hungry.
Right.
So it's a pretty common construct, restraint. There's even a really cool theory developed in late 1970s called restraint theory that really explains this process too. And so that's the scale. We wanted to keep that because it really is an important clinical construct. I imagine a lot of you have seen this restraint theory play out in your clients. We also wanted to add in restricting as a little bit of a different concept as well.
Right. And so Michelle's followed up with a question about whether a high score in that case is equivalent to a high amount of laps.
People who have a high score are going to be prone to a high amount of laps.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for sure, you want to see, as you're working with clients, you want to see that score go down and really work on the client with the mindset. It's kind of, and they may or may not be actively dieting, but they're really trying to, they're really thinking about it a lot. So even if they're not lapsing, it's a burden to carry around that level of restraint, to always be thinking about calories and eating and not wanting to eat, and
Right.
I think it's always a probably not a good thing. It's not a healthy thing in general.
Right, right. And that's the same across all of the scales of the EPSI, where a higher score equates to a higher level of severity in whatever scale that is. We've got a question here from Ivy Silver about how does the information in recovery record improve this measure? So,
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it makes it easy for the clinician because, again, you don't have to score, you don't even have to enter the data into a system. It gives you information on how changes are occurring across different administrations of the EPSI. And I think one of the things I'm very, very excited about is that as we're collecting information, de-identified information on my part, from these outcomes trackings, it's going to enable us to really additionally refine the measure so that it is even more useful. And so I think giving better norms, all kinds of things that I think are going to be really helpful just because we'll have the data to be able to do these things.
and we're very excited about that. Just last year, when we introduced the EPSI later in the year, we've since had over 100,000 EPSIs completed in recovery records. So there's a lot that we can do with that. And of course, Kelsie and her team are, the absolute experts in taking that data and improving the instrument, developing norms for users of the app. So over time, you'll see that recovery record, this feature will evolve to hopefully help guide you and tell you more about how you can use this to understand your clients. We've got another question from Chastity, which is a good question. If you're a dietitian or you're working with a client who has a structured meal plan, could that potentially elevate the cognitive restraint score? Do we know anything about that?
It potentially could. So I think that's a great comment, and one of the reasons why it's perfectly good to look at norms. We have not looked at the EPSI in a dieting population, okay? And so it's potentially possible that a person could be elevated, but again, I would say, you don't want people to be 24/7 probably obsessed with eating.
Right.
So if you do see an elevation, it could be worth it to talk with the client just about their mindset, because we want people to be able to have a healthy body weight. It's really important if people have, negative health issues as a result of obesity that they can get treatment for that. So I think in that population, it may be worth following up just to ask, because I can't say for certain whether that would be a negative thing. It could be positive, but again, I would say, if they're walking around with a mindset that's so strict and rigid, that could eventually be something that turns out to be negative for them, because it's almost kind of like a rule violation type of thing. I eat a little bit of candy and now I've blown it kind of mindset. That's usually not a healthy mindset for dieters even to be in.
So for a lot of patients, particularly at higher levels of care, they're working with a dietitian. They have a meal plan as a part of their program, but I don't know if there's been research to look at using a meal plan and that construct specifically in the context of eating disorder care. But I do know that, obviously I don't know how familiar you are with the exchanges system, which allows for substitutions and allows for some flexibility, was, I'm guessing, applied to this field to address some of that.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I like about the exchange system. I mean, in terms of commercial diets, that's one of the things I like about Weight Watchers is they have points instead of calories, and at least until they made some of the recent changes, it was pretty flexible in terms of how people who engage with that program could allocate their points.
Right.
So, I think the goal is to help people achieve healthy eating pattern and reduce maybe their overall intake or even increase their intake depending on the situation in a way that is less likely to trigger that restraint mindset. But I think there's a difference between restraint and kind of, subscribing to or following a meal plan.
Right.
But I think it's a wonderful question.
It is a great question.
I wish I had a better answer, but I think that at this point you would probably want to follow up with that client and really see, okay, is this high score something I should be worried about or not?
Right. Yeah, and even I think that's something we can potentially look at in the data, which users of recovery record do have a meal plan in recovery record and how that relates to their restraint, and are there any moderators of that if there is a relationship. So great questions, Chastity, and hopefully we can develop more knowledge in that area in the future. And I imagine, I mean, there's a lot of work done with planning ahead for meals, which for some people may, I'm guessing, be effective in strategy and trying to manage some of that cognitive restraint, but that's not, I'm not referring to any specific publication there. So, okay, there's a couple more questions, but we don't have a lot longer on the webinar. So I'll ask you to park those, but Kelsie, hopefully you'll be open to fielding some questions potentially at the end or even after the webinar by email if you do have those. So feel free to email those to me if you want, jenna@recoveryrecord.com, and I can pass those along to Kelsie. But we're going to jump into, and I'll see actually there's one of these questions I can probably address in the demo as well. Okay, so I'm going to set up the demo. While I actually do this, there was one question about why tap into these constructs versus just ask for frequency of behaviors over 28 days, and what the difference is between those frequency questions and these constructs. Don't know, Kelsie, if you...
Yeah, well, the EPSI, the scale for the EPSI is a frequency scale. And so often, though, when you are looking at individual behaviors over time, they may or may not be so reliable. And you want to look at kind of the aggregate, a lot of different behaviors that are happening for the person, and we can get normative information on these different scales. And so we really like the scales approach because you get a broad range of information, and it is on a frequency scale. It is in the past month, so it is very similar to that approach. But in some ways, it's also very easy for the client because you're not asking them to remember how many times in the past 28 days did you X, Y, Z, but how frequently are you doing these things in a kind of a more broad sense, like rarely, sometimes, that kind of thing. So you're getting information that's useful and that we find is related to actual behaviors in a way that's very simple for the client to report on. I don't know how accurate it is to ask, how many times have you done such and such over the past however many times. Obviously, we need to know that for diagnosis. This questionnaire isn't for diagnosis purpose. It's really to try to understand some of the underlying processes and behaviors and issues that are going on for the client. And then you can always follow that up with asking specific questions about behaviors. And sometimes that might be easier to do in a one-on-one type format as well. So we wanted to have something that was very similar in terms of the format to a self-report questionnaire, and something that wouldn't be a huge time burden and a huge memory burden to clients, but also still get some information on frequency of behaviors that seem to be very relevant to a lot of people's clinical practice.
Right. Great. So, okay, so I'm just going to... So of course this demo worked beautifully when we tested it just before I got started. So now I'm having trouble launching this. So hopefully we'll be up and running in just a moment. Maybe while I'm doing this, Kelsie, what do you think about, so obviously the clinicians are receiving self-monitoring about frequency of behaviours in recovery record, and looking at those relative to the EPSI scales.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great approach, and it gives you a lot of information. For sure, you want to see that the frequency of behaviors are going down. I think the nice thing about EPSI is you're also looking at kind of patterns of all these different constructs and how for that client they may interact over time. It can maybe give you some heads up too, for some of my clients, if they're eating more than they have before, they may have a lot more body dissatisfaction, which seems like a real negative thing. That may be something that's kind of expected along the process that you'll eventually want to work on to get that in line with some of the behaviors. So some things may lag behind others, and may explain kind of why you're seeing different things in the scale. But to me, recovery record's a great way to get a lot of the information that you need in a very, easy quick format
Right.
that doesn't take time away from the therapy process, but that really gives you a huge amount of pretty broad information on the client. And I mean, to me, it always seemed like, well, is this really going to make a difference? But the research is so clear that when they've done randomized clinical trials, the clinicians who are assigned to look at that assessment data versus the clients or clinicians who are not assigned to, there's huge differences in how the clients do in therapy over time. So I think, to me, it's a great tool for looking at things. And I don't know that I'd want to do one or the other. I think having both that frequency information plus the self-reports, plus obviously your own clinical interview, your own clinical impressions of the client is going to be the best situation, that having tools in the toolbox is really helpful.
Great. So speaking of tools in the toolbox, we've actually developed a handbook which gives kind of a step-by-step guide to using the features in Recovery Record. I think clinicians can feel overwhelmed by the broad scope of possibilities of Recovery Record, and so we do run webinars, but also that handbook will be a good lookbook to have to see how to use those features. So unfortunately, this demo is just not working. Like I said, we tried this just before and it worked beautifully, and now it just doesn't seem to be. So what I might do instead is show you the handbook and how the feature is used there and the different displays of data, just so that you can see that. And then we'll follow up this webinar with a video version of the webinar so that you can revisit any aspect of this conversation, as well as a canned video of tour of that, the way that outcome collection in the EPSI happens in Recovery Records, so that you can have a look at that and have that on hand. I think that'll probably be the best way to go. Sorry about that, everyone, but okay, so I'm going to now share my screen so that you can see. Okay. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now. So here's our handbook, and as you can see, it covers a lot of different aspects of Recovery Record. So we're going to skip down to tracking outcomes, which is toward the bottom of Recovery Record. One thing I'll say that you may not be familiar with is when you link with a patient, one of your patients, after they've logged their very first meal, they get a little prompt in their app which invites them to complete the EPSI, and that's as soon as you've linked with them. And the reason for that is that if a lot of clinicians are using Recovery Record when they first get a client, so almost as a part of the admissions process, and that you can get baseline data. So if you're linking early on in that treatment process, which I certainly would recommend, you're going to have that baseline data, and then every 30 days we'll invite your patient again to complete the EPSI in your app. And so here you can see this is the yellow banner. This is what your patient will see after you've linked with them in their app. Now that banner actually will not disappear. It will kind of annoy them for a little while until they complete the EPSI. So they'll go in and they'll see, this is a sort of Likert style scale response option in these questions, exactly per the standard EPSI that Kelsie has developed. Kelsie, did you want to describe a little bit about the feedback that we have developed based on their completion of the EPSI in Recovery Record?
We have some feedback based on the completion of the EPSI, and we tried to be encouraging each step of the way, and also to explain to any individual one item. We can't really interpret. That's not how the EPSI was developed. It was really developed to look at these scales and really how the person's response kind of fits in with or doesn't fit in with other norm populations, like other patients, community members, that type of thing. So if they make relatively small changes that are in kind of a positive direction, we provide them with some kind of congratulatory feedback. We also give them some positive feedback, even if they've been logging and things haven't been changing, but they've just been logging information, because we know that's a challenge too sometimes. Mm-hmm. And things get worse in terms of their eating behaviors or cognitions, we might know that they have, maybe had a challenging week, that there's often slips on the path to recovery, and that, we ask them to kind of reflect on what maybe made things more challenging, to share that information with you, their clinician, and that, basically the Recovery Record app is here to kind of support them on that path, and they're really to keep logging the information to kind of see how they can continue on the recovery process, but really trying to recognize that recovery for really anything isn't a linear process, that there's ups and downs on the way, but really trying to encourage people to reflect, talk with clinicians, and really try to just keep going. So we really try to be very positive in the type of feedback that we give. Encourage them if they're on kind of a streak of continuing to make these positive changes, and trying not to induce shame if there are slips on the recovery process. So that's kind of how we've tried to structure the feedback to the clients.
Right, and it is really fantastic content, and a part of the reason for this summative feedback is that clients, once they've completed an EPSI, they're sort of left out there hanging. You do need to provide them, well, they have a desire for some sort of closure or feedback. However, if we give them the raw scores or even the standard deviations, there's a lot of questions that raises, and so we sort of leave that to the clinicians to help them to understand their scores, but we provide them with this summative feedback instead. And so far, the response has been very positive to that. However, that does leave your job with having a looking at the scores. So let's have a look at what you see. When a patient does complete an in-app questionnaire, you will see this pop up in the patient's log feed, or even on the home screen in the activity feed. And it's going to look something like this. The first EPSI will not have upward or downward arrows because that's showing a trend in a change in the score. We actually set the threshold at least 0.2 standard deviations of change, and you're going to see an upward or downward arrow there. So I don't know, Kelsie, did you want to comment a little bit on what clinicians should be looking for in this information?
You definitely want to be looking for those arrows. Different scales have different numbers of items, and so for sure you want to be looking at the arrows, but really to see, how big of a deal kind of are these changes, and to kind of compare them to one another. You can really look at the standard deviation from the clinical norms to see how are clients doing relative to a clinical population in terms of their deviation. So that can give you a little bit more information with regard to how strong are these changes that you're seeing over time.
Great. So one thing that we're looking at updating here is because there's a different number of items for each of those scales, we're probably going to change the raw score to a Z score going forward, so that I think one area just to be mindful of in the current format of the app is a very high, a relatively higher score does not necessarily mean that, well, those scales, they're just not comparable. The maximum score for each scale is different. So probably keeping an eye on the arrows, but also the standard deviations for the moment is a good way to go. And you'll see some improvements to help navigate this tool coming through in the future. And then we've got, once you've had more than one EPSI completed in the app, you'll see that the Trends tab you can click on, and you'll be able to select different scales and have a look at standard deviation from clinical norms and also raw score and how that's changing over time, which again is quite interesting to have a look at. So I think that's probably all that we need to cover there. So if you have questions on that, we've got a couple more minutes if you wanted to send those through, to type those in about how to understand and read this formatting. And then we might have a chat about what's in store for the future.